I commend this bill to the House. Thank you,
Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Marianne Street.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to rise to speak to the Land Transport and Road User Charges Legislation Amendment Bill. It does. And I am probably the only member in the House who is absolutely delighted that this piece of legislation has finally come before the House under urgency. And let me explain, because it isn't immediately obvious why anybody would be so pleased that we would be debating tractors at midnight on a Wednesday. But I am personally delighted that this piece of legislation has finally seen the light of day. Mr. Speaker, I happen to chair the Regulations Review Committee, and you will know, people will know by the attached information that is available on this piece of legislation that this has now been the subject of 2 reports from the Regulations Review Committee. Why should it cause such fuss? Well, let me try to encapsulate that as briefly as I can. Last year, the Ministry of Transport brought in a regulation, Regulation 8, to continue the existing exemption for farmers who operate light ruck vehicles for agricultural operations. So, light vehicles, tractors with limited on-road use, pending. And this is the bit that's really interesting, that the Ministry decided to introduce this regulation, quote, pending outstanding policy decisions on how best to manage, unquote, these exemptions. In other words, the government hadn't done it in the legislation. In the road user charges, they had not done it. And so the ministry officials read the minds of Cabinet and said, we're going to put in a regulation that says we'll just roll this exemption over because it's all going to come to an end on the 30th of June in 2013 anyway. I'm sorry, officials do not have that power. They do not have that power. And a regulation was made that was never brought to the Regulations Review Committee except by afterwards, that this regulation was made in anticipation of the policy position the government was going to take. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. The government intends a policy position, it states that position, then it enacts it in legislation, if it is a competent government. But this government isn't. And so it left this bit out. And it meant that these guys with these off-road, mainly off-road vehicles, carried on paying a swathe of money in RUC contributions, and the regulation was completely out of order. And so my predecessor, Charles Chauvel, moved that it be disallowed. So the ministry, what the ministry did actually, at the 1st of August 2012, when the Act came into force, the Road User Charges Act, decisions on whether and how to implement an exemption for light ruck vehicles hadn't been made. So the decision hadn't been made, so the officials stepped into the gap and tried to fill it in. I'm sorry, that is not the way it goes. So they just thought that they would roll over this existing exemption, and it had used transitional regulations rather than saying, Minister, you need to go back. And I understand Minister Simon Bridges has introduced this tonight, but it is in the name of Jerry Brownlee. Perhaps between them they could get half an idea right. But at the moment, all this is doing is correcting something that should have been done by the 1st of August 2012. 1st of August 2012. Here we are a year and several weeks late. A year and several weeks late. And so what did they do? The officials put in a regulation. Charles Chauvel got up in the House at the agreement of the Regulations Review Committee, 3 of whose members are national members, and it is unconstitutionally, in my view, stacked, because it has always been a bipartisan committee before now, but now has 3 national members, 2 Labor members. And so, anyway, these 3 national members, whose names are signed to this report, agreed that it should be disallowed. So Charles Chauvel went ahead and moved the disallowance motion. Then, the minister did not allocate House time to debate the disallowance motion, and therefore the regulation was disallowed. In other words, it was overturned. It ceased to exist. It went up in a puff of smoke. So the reason, however, that the minister gave, that he chose, the Minister Jerry Brownlee gave in front of the Regs Review Committee doing the second report on this regulation, said that he didn't want to allocate House time to devoting Mr Chauvel's motion, because he believed that given the infrequency of using the disallowance procedure, it wouldn't be a good precedent for the government to use its majority to vote down a disallowance procedure. I'm sorry, that is what it is for. If the government doesn't want its regulations disallowed, it should make some time, get up in the House and say this shouldn't be disallowed because we were the plonkers who put the inadequate legislation in to start with, and we are too embarrassed to correct the legislation. So we're just going to let this go on. Because what happened after the disallowance of the regulation? The minister reinstated it. It wasn't any better the second time. It wasn't any better. So we have a complete litany of ineptitude. A complete litany of ineptitude. So the minister introduced it a second time with no improvement. Should have amended the legislation, for goodness sake, but didn't. And so I moved another disallowance motion because it wasn't any better than the first time. It wasn't any better than the first time. Can I just say that I withdrew my disallowance motion on the 11th of June this year. I withdrew my disallowance motion on the understanding that this legislation was going to be brought forward to correct the matter in time for the 1st of August, of this year. And here we are in parliamentary time on the 27th of August, putting up for first reading, for goodness sake, a piece of legislation that should have been in place in order to correct the mistakes previously, should have been in place in time for the 1st of August. So for the start of the legislation, after the regulation had been, would have been rescinded or overtaken. But no, they still couldn't get it right. And so this is just an extraordinary list of ineptitude, of one mistake after another, which the minister could have fixed last year. I don't know if it's Simon Bridges' bailiwick now. I feel sorry for him because he doesn't understand this stuff to start with. So how can he possibly amend it? How can he possibly fix it? Being such a limited person in this respect, it's very difficult to imagine how he might ever fix it. So here we have the legislation wrong in the first place, a regulation put in place that was not allowable. The regulation was disallowed. The government didn't put aside time to debate it. then reinstated a regulation which had been disallowed, and by the time that it expired at the 30th of June this year, it was still not ready with legislation to correct it. Mr. Speaker, this would be farcical if it were not serious for the poor old farmers. This would just be hilarious if it were not for the poor old farmers. So try to get it right this time, please.
Mr. Speaker.
I call Order. I'm calling Dr. Cam Calder.
Mr. Speaker.